Monster Hunter World introduced Turf Wars to the series. These occur when two monsters encounter each other and fight over territory, and they've appeared in every subsequent entry since then. Turf Wars help convey many things to the player, including a monster's strengths, weaknesses, and position in the ecosystem. But as each new game and expansion comes out, some of these aspects are either increased or diminished, as the roles of certain monsters are cycled around and each game has a different focus. In this video, we will discuss the different ways Monster Hunter World made use of Turf Wars to convey aspects of the world, and how subsequent games made use of the mechanic for different reasons. World was the first game to incorporate monsters fighting with each other like this, but the concept of this happening existed earlier in the series, almost always in the form of cutscenes. As early as the first two generations could we witness FMVs, or full motion videos, of monsters fighting with each other. These are pre-recorded computer-generated videos that were very common around the PlayStation 1 and 2 eras, as what was depicted in those scenes was not limited by the console hardware, and they tend to load pretty fast. These could be as simple as a Tigrex hunting down a Popo, two Diabloses dueling in the desert, or even the fearsome Acantor tanking a Gravios laser and snapping its neck. These scenes would generally be unlocked as you beat the quests, making them serve as a cool reward. There were in-game cutscenes to introduce the monster, but they were never particularly advanced. The third generation introduced a stamina system for monsters, where they would become exhausted over time. To regain their stamina, they would go after small monsters, killing and eating them, which was the first time we got to see monster vs monster interactions during gameplay. The CGI pre-rendered cinematics were also present, often showing monsters interacting with each other. The fact that large monster interactions were only in pre-recorded cutscenes implied that while the developers really wanted to show them to us, it wasn't yet possible for them to be implemented in real-time gameplay. 4 Ultimate took another step towards this dream, as it not only featured a wide variety of monster interactions throughout the in-game cutscenes, but your hunter would also play a role, stumbling upon the monsters, running from them, and evading surprise attacks. It was cool to see, but also showed that, from a technological standpoint, they had reached a point where monster vs monster interactions could happen in the game itself, even if it was just cutscenes. Remember the Diablos vs Diablos scene from the older games? Here is his introduction in 4 Ultimate, featuring a battle between the two of them with your hunter caught in the crossfire. All of this is being rendered by the game in real time. They're really impressive considering how these monster introductions used to be. Older scenes would mostly consist of a monster walking onto the set and performing a few attacks at nothing, but the 4 Ultimate introductions are clearly custom animated. So at this point, it was pretty obvious that the developers really wanted monster vs monster fights in the game. Even the CGI introduction scene for Generations had 3 instances of this happening. There was one direct large monster vs large monster interaction that could happen in real-time gameplay, involving the Celtus and the much larger Celtus Queen. When she gets exhausted, there's a slightly uncommon chance of her grabbing Celtus and smashing him into the ground, killing him and allowing for her to regain stamina by eating him. Her subspecies, the Desert Celtus Queen, takes this a step further by throwing her partner with such force that his body disintegrates, requiring her to summon a new one. So finally, Monster Hunter World comes along, released for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One with a PC version coming later. Overall much stronger systems compared to the previous consoles and especially handhelds that the series formerly thrived on. World has a huge emphasis on environment and the ecology within the game, and Turf Wars are a huge part of that. When two monsters are in the same area and notice each other, they will start roaring, and a notification on the side will alert you that a turf war is about to happen. The monsters will move towards each other and start battling, dealing a sizable amount of damage until one emerges victorious while the other flails around on the ground. These battle animations are all pre-made, and the outcome of the turf war is always the same. But the fact that they can happen anytime, anywhere, during actual real-time gameplay is really impressive to see. Monsters cannot turf war against every other monster in the game. Usually they'll only fight specific monsters that they will encounter a lot within the same locale. For example, Anjanath World is usually encountered in the Ancient Forest, and thus has turf wars with the Great Jagras, Tobi-Kadachi, and Rathalos, who all live there as well. Puke on the other hand also lives in the forest, but cannot fight anyone in this game. Monster Hunter World allows for 3 monsters to appear on a quest, so there can be a lot of variety in who can show up. While out on a quest, it is unlikely that none of the monsters present will be able to turf war with each other, so you will be seeing these throughout the game. One of the main purposes of turf wars is free damage for the player. They result in one or both monsters taking sizable amounts of damage, so if your target is the loser, then it's a huge benefit. If you're hunting Barroth and Diablos beats him to the ground, that's a very helpful assist for you, as it means Barroth will go down faster. The free damage aside, I would say Turf Wars do 3 things very well. The first is the spectacle, or to put it simply, seeing our faves fight each other. The Monster Hunter series has had a long history, and there's so many monsters introduced over the past 20 years. Being able to witness them fight, watching their unique strategies, and seeing who comes out on top can be really fun to witness. For example, Diablos will fight Rathian by digging down and ambushing her from below, and just as he's about to finish the job, she barely manages to get away. This is something we experience to a greater extent throughout Iceborne, Rise and Sunbreak, as more and more returning fan favourites are brought back and new ones are created, and it's always cool to see. Another important thing they do really well is enhance the ecology of the monsters by showing off their unique abilities. We get to experience them when hunting, but it's really interesting to see how the monsters utilise their unique traits against other similar sized foes. For example, Anjanath mostly attacks with his giant jaws, and when he tries to go for Tobi-Kadachi, the electric spikes on his back actually shock him and cause him to briefly back off. Anjanath bites back soon after, but it's a cool detail. Barroth likes to attack by charging. Diablos also likes to attack by charging. Their turf war consists of a charging battle, and while Diablos will struggle with another Diablos, Barroth loses immediately upon contact, which is amusing to see. The fanged Odogaron is smaller than the brute's Radoban, but he still manages to use his superior speed and agility to leap onto him and rip chunks off, causing a total defeat. In my eyes, however, the coolest thing Turf Wars do in this game is enhance the ecology of the world itself, by conveying to us the food chains and hierarchy of the monsters in each locale we can hunt in. As I said earlier, World has a huge emphasis on ecology. Monsters all have unique behaviours in their environments, and there's tons of endemic life everywhere. In the ancient forest, the Great Jagras roams around on ground level, and Anjanath completely bullies him. Anjanath also beats Tobi-Kadachi, although to his credit, Tobi fights back a bit. Through these turf wars, we can infer that Anjanath is the boss of the ancient forest and more or less dominates the lesser creatures. Except that's not really true because Rathalos lives at the top of the forest and destroys Anjanath, who can't even fight back. And this ultimately shows that while Anjanath is strong, Rathalos is the true apex of the ancient forest. The main monsters who can roam the Wildspire Waste are Gyrotodus, Barroth, Rathian and Diablos. The first two fight each other and tie. Gyrotodus tries to ambush Barroth from below and gets thrown off, but not before dealing lots of damage. As we established earlier, Diablos beats Rathian and Barroth, cementing him as the apex of the Wildspire Waste, and at launch, the only thing that could beat Diablos was another Diablos. Yes, this battle can finally happen in real-time gameplay. We've come so far. Moving on to the Coral Highlands, Titiaku mostly doesn't fight anyone. However, Paolumu and Legiana can turf war, with the latter winning, making her the apex of the Coral Highlands. The Rotten Vale is where things get interesting. The monsters present are the Great Gyros, Radoban, and Odogaron. Gyros has no turf wars, but Odogaron handily beats Radoban. The thing is, Odogaron can also visit the Coral Highlands, where he can tussle with Titiaku in the shortest turf war ever, and he can pummel Paolumu. In the base game, he could not turf war with Legiana, but after the Iceborne update they could tie. So naturally, you would assume that Odogaron is almost the top dog of the Coral Highlands and the apex of the Rotten Vale. Wrong! That title goes to the Elder Dragon Valhazak, who Odogaron tries to fight and fails miserably. It's quite wild to see. Odo jumps onto Hazak and starts biting, and the Elder Dragon does nothing, simply waiting for his toxic effluvium to take effect, which weakens Odogaron so much that he falls off and loses. The Elder's Recess has an indisputable apex in the form of Nergigante. None of the smaller monsters can really stand up to him, and the Elder Dragons that try are beaten into the ground. Kushala Daora and Teostra tie, cementing them both as second place. Overall, it's fantastic how these turf wars don't just look cool and help the player, but also enhance the world building of this game. It's clear they put so much effort into designing the ecology of these locales, and conveying food chains through turf wars is really clever. Monster Hunter World was the first game to add monsters through updates, and these guys were usually stronger than most monsters in the base game. Deviljho was added with World's first update. He had built his reputation in the older games as an invading monster, often encountered earlier than expected in any of the game's locales, and if he invaded your hunts, he would almost always be stronger than anything you'd be currently fighting. So in World, they gave him turf wars to properly reflect his position. He completely humbles Rathalos and Legiana, grabbing and throwing them to the ground. He grabs Diablos by the head, physically lifts him up, and slams him down too. Those are the apexes of 3 different locales, and it's only later in Iceborne where he's allowed to throw down and tie with Valhazak and Nergigante variants. And believe it or not, it gets better. When encountering different medium-sized monsters, Deviljho will pick them up in his jaws and carry them around. He can even use them to attack hunters and chuck them. This includes the Great Jagras, Tsitsiaku and... Huh? Odogaron? What? That's right folks, Odogaron gets bullied by Deviljho, and he whines like a puppy the entire time. Combined with the Valhazak Turf War, there's this amazing subtext that, while Odogaron is an adept fighter, he often bites off far more than he can chew, and gets humbled for it. These specific Deviljho interactions are not technically Turf Wars, but it's still worth mentioning them. Bazalgos at launch didn't have any Turf Wars. His whole deal is that he likes to invade hunts and bomb the area. He's basically World's Deviljho, and as such, was given a Turf War with him. Deviljho is on the verge of winning, only for Basil's bombs to explode and hurt him, which emphasises that his bombs are his biggest strength. Lunastra was also introduced in a later update. She is basically the female Teostra, and is much stronger than him. She doesn't actually have any unique Turf Wars, instead reuses Teostras. But when fighting Nergigante, there is a slight difference in that she releases a fiery explosion as she goes down, which shows that she's stronger than Teostra, but not quite on the same level as Nergigante. On that note, it's important to stress that not all Turf Wars are unique. Some are recycled and simply swap out the bodies of one or both monsters. Lunastra is one such example, but Deviljho's battles against Rathalos and Legiana are identical. In this case, it's not really that big of a deal. Teostra and Lunastra are very similar, and Legiana and Rathalos both attack Deviljho in ways that make sense for them. It's also worth mentioning that in most cases, subspecies and variants have identical Turf Wars to their base forms. Azor Rathalos shares Rathalos' Turf Wars, same with Black Diablos and the normal one. Lunastra and Teostra have a unique bond attack, where they'll combine their supernovas for a huge double explosion. So far, it's the only bond attack in the series, but it's worth mentioning as it highlights their unique partnership. So Turf Wars in Monster Hunter World were used to show how our faves would fare against each other, as well as potentially assist us in battle, but they also helped convey the food chains of each locale to us in a clever way, which further enhanced the game's main goal in creating a living, breathing world. However, with the arrival of the Iceborne expansion and an avalanche of over 30 new monsters, things changed. Perhaps for the better, but also for the worse. While Monster Hunter World laid down a foundation, Iceborne built upon it. It not only added dozens of monsters, many of them iconic and each with their own unique abilities, but with them a huge amount of Turf Wars for both existing monsters and the new additions. Many monsters already in World were given subspecies or variants, and they largely Turf War in the same manner as their base counterparts. For example, Savage Deviljho fights Rathalos the same way Deviljho did, Volga Anjanath fights Viper Tobi-Kadachi the same way the originals did, and so on. And of course, the monsters introduced to the game with Iceborne were given Turf Wars. Before we go any further, I would like to thank MonsterSlayerSquad for providing many of the Turf Wars involving Valkana, Savage Do, Rajang and a few others, as I had trouble acquiring footage for them on my own. Any footage borrowed from them will be marked as such. So, here are Iceborne's unique Turf Wars. Newcomer Banbaro tries to fight returning monster Barioth, but gets humbled badly and tossed across the arena, resulting in a win for the Flying Wyvern. Returning flagship Glavenus faces off with Rathalos and wins. While Rathalos briefly looks like he has the upper hand, Glavenus is able to throw him to the ground. Another returning flagship, Brachydios, also faces Rathalos. He goes for a punch and misses, but is able to grab Rathalos and pull him off, which ends the fight in a tie. Ruin and Nergigante Turf Wars against Savage Deviljho, gets grabbed and lifted up, but is able to punch his way down, resulting in a tie. Those are the new, unique Turf Wars in the base game. Rajang was added in the first title update, with some new ones of his own. First of all, Kirin gets his very first Turf War, and it results in a devastating loss, as Rajang snaps off his horn and eats it, turning golden as a result. This is a very close in-game recreation of what happens in Rajang's introduction cutscene. Rajang can also fight Ruin and Nergigante, which results in a tie. This is a pretty crazy fight, and at one point, Rajang even Shoryukens Ruiner, before getting smacked away. So that's 6 new Turf Wars, which isn't that much, especially when you consider that 2 of them were added in an update, but remember, I stressed new, unique Turf Wars. Let's look at another one that was added. The standard Anjanath we all know and know didn't get any new Turf Wars, but his new stronger subspecies Volga Anjanath has many. Volga is a notable exception to how subspecies turf wars are handled, as he can fight many monsters that Anjanath can't. Here's Volga facing off with Barioth. Volga opens with a hip check before they tumble over each other. Barioth bites him before getting kicked off, resulting in a tie as both monsters take damage. Volga Anjanath can also face off with returning flagship Tigrex. Volga opens with a hip check and they tumble over each other. Tigrex gets in a bite before being kicked off, tying again. Volga also turf wars Nagakuga. He opens with a hip it's the same thing. Like, the exact same animation plays for each monster with the same outcome each time. Glavenus and Brachydios are very different brute wyverns. One has a giant sword for a tail, and the other has slimy fists that he can punch with. When they turf war against Rathalos, these unique traits come into play. But when they turf war Tigrex, the animation is completely recycled from the Volga Anjanath turf war. So all these fights are completely identical to each other. Let's look at Nagakuga vs Rathalos. He strikes with his claws and practically lifts up Nagakuga, who dodges his finishing strike and leaps at him as they tumble over each other, resulting in a tie as they both take damage. A cool turf war that plays out identically when Rathalos faces Tigrex. Barioth cannot fight Rathalos, but he can face off with Legiana, where the same animation will play again. World had some recycled turf wars, but they were mostly introduced with updates and do not outweigh the unique ones. Not just that, but the recycled turf wars would only swap out one of the monsters, meaning the animation would still be unique for the other. This is not the case in Iceborne. There are so many more recycled turf wars that are designed to be interchangeable for both sides. The Deviljho and Lunastra turf wars in World would only swap out one of the opponents, meaning the animation was still unique to the other. And truth be told, the rest of Iceborne's turf wars are mostly like this. I refer to these as semi-recycled turf wars. Odogaron and his subspecies Ebony Odogaron have several new turf wars that are unique to them but not their opponents. They can face off against brute wyverns Glavenus and Brachydios, as well as flying wyverns Nagakuga, Barioth and Tigrex, with 2 animations for each group. Earlier I mentioned that he was given a Legiana turf war in Iceborne, but Rathalos also shares it, and in every turf war, Odogaron ties. Do you recall his turf war against Radoban? Because Ebony Odogaron can roam the Elder's Recess, that turf war is recycled for Uragan, resulting in a loss for him. Diablos can fight Glavenus, which has the brute wyvern lift him up by his neck and slam him down. Diablos proceeds to get up and chuck Glavenus behind him. A really wild turf war that is also shared with Volga Anjanath. Zinogre can turf war with Rathalos, which has the latter grab onto his head and refuse to let go, before being shaken off and smacked away with a tailspin. The same animation plays out for Yarn Garuga, resulting in a tie. Zinogre can also turf war with Brachydios, Glavenus and Volga Anjanath, where the brute wyvern lifts and pins him down with his jaws before Zinogre frees himself and strikes back with a tailspin, again ending the whole thing in a tie. Savage Deviljho has more turf wars with Elder Dragons, as he can battle Velkhana by briefly wrestling with her before having a laser battle, causing an explosion that damages the both of them, resulting in a tie. This exact turf war also occurs with Black Veil Valhazak and Namiel. Ruin and Nergigante can also fight Velkhana in a battle of the flagships. This turf war was technically unique upon release due to its outcome, but it's borderline identical to the Kushala vs Nergigante turf war. Instead of getting thrown across the arena, Velkhana blasts Ruiner off with Icy Breath, resulting in a tie. Then there's Rajang, the only unique update monster to get any turf wars. He has a few new battles as mentioned earlier, but there are some recycled ones too, both semi and fully. He can turf war with the flying wyverns, Rathalos and Legiana. They claw at him, but he grabs their tail and swings them around. This turf war is also given to Rathian, Yarn Garuga, and Puke? He finally gets a turf war and it's against Rajang? He can turf war with Teostra, Lunastra, and Black Veil Valhazak, which has him wrestle with them while they spew fire and effluvium into his face. He knocks them over before they kick him away, resulting in a tie. He can fight Kushala Daora, Namiel and Velkhana, but all these animations are recycled from Ruin and Nergigante vs Velkhana, which itself is only slightly altered from Kushala vs Nergigante. The only difference is that Rajang gets kicked away. That's not the only Ruiner recycling, as his turf war with Savage Deviljho also happens for Rajang. And finally, Velkhana recycles Teostra and Kushala's turf war so that she can battle them and Lunastra, but a minor difference is that she ends the fight with an icy laser, resulting in a draw. So, that's how turf wars were handled in Iceborne. It's nice to have so many new ones, but quite a few major issues have been introduced or exacerbated, mostly thanks to the excessive recycling. The food chain aspect I praised earlier for Monster Hunter World has been heavily diminished in Iceborne, thanks to the constant stalemates or ties. World's Turf Wars mostly had straightforward wins or losses, with roughly 3 to 4 ending in a tie. Contrast that with Iceborne, where there's more than 20. Because so many of these Turf Wars tie, it's hard to create a totem pole of sorts for each locale. In World, it was fairly definitive, with Rathalos, Diablos, Legiana, Balhazak and Nergigante being the apexes of the main locales. But now it's unclear. Is Rathalos really the king of the ancient forest? Or is it Nargacuga, Tigrex, Slavinus, Ebony Odogaron? The locales are just too crowded for that to happen. But even if these turf wars are no longer used to establish a pecking order, they should at least look cool, satisfying to watch. But because so many of these fights are recycled, it means that the spectacle aspect has been diminished too. One of the best parts about Turf Wars in World was that we got to see monsters fight against each other using their own skills and abilities. Odogaron would beat his opponents using his agility, Paolumu would be defeated while in his balloon mode, and win or lose, Diablos would always make use of his horns. However, because so many wars in Iceborne are recycled, this aspect is not as present. Let's look at Nargacuga, Barioth and Tigrex. Each of these monsters are so distinct from each other. Nargacuga is a swift, agile wyvern, with blades on his arms and a flexible tail. Barioth flies and makes use of the ice element, and Tigrex uses overwhelming strength to overpower his foes. The only thing they really share is their body structure, but this was enough for their turf wars to be designed for all three of them to share. As such, the fights cannot make use of their unique traits and instead have to be more general, which results in turf wars that are far less interesting than they could be. Nargacuga doesn't get to pounce, Barioth doesn't create a cyclone, and Tigrex doesn't pin down his prey. Instead they all just kind of tumble over their enemies. This also applies to the Brute Wyvern's other turf wars. Glavenus has a razor sharp tail, and Brachydios has explosive fists, but in most of their turf wars they don't get to use them. Their battles with Tigrex, Diablos, and even Zinogre are designed so that fellow Brute Wyvern, Volga and Janath can also turf war, so the animation was designed to be very general, in order to fit all three brutes. As such, the unique aspects do not shine, making for very flavourless turf wars. The biggest example of this is Velkhana vs Ruin and Nergigante. Velkhana is a swift and graceful elder dragon, who can manipulate her tail like a rapier and make use of ice in various ways. None of that really comes through in her turf war. She just rushes Ruiner and gets smacked down pathetically, because this animation is mostly recycled from the Kushala Deora turf war. Velkhana at least pushes Nergigante away, but it just comes across so badly. What really sucks is that Iceborne is Velkhana's debut entry, and in this game there is not a single turf war unique to her, as they're all shared with other elder dragons. It's even more ridiculous when this specific turf war is reused for Rajang. Okay Velkhana, Rajang is physically stronger than you, but he can't fly and he's weak to ice. You should get in a quick stab before— Wait Velkhana, what are you doing? Velkhana, no! Stab him! Stab him! Now there's a huge discrepancy with the turf war. I know what Velkhana is capable of, so I can't help but wonder if things would have gone differently if she actually got to use her unique abilities. What if she stabbed Rajang? Would she have won? This issue can be seen with Brachydios and his turf wars. In his 3 Ultimate Ecology, he's shown winning fights thanks to his powerful punches, with the slime acting as the final blow. And this is even shown in Iceborne's introduction cutscene for him. Now in the game itself, he ties every single one of his turf wars, and most of them are recycled. This creates a problem, because he mostly doesn't get to use his fists, and never gets to use his slime. Would he have won if he did? We don't know, and that's kind of frustrating. It's the same with Glavenus' sharp tail. Would he have won if he actually got to open with a swift strike? Or would he lose? We don't know. And the recycling means that their turf wars feel very out of character for them. I'm not too impressed with Zinogre's turf wars either. Despite him facing 3 different types of foe, they all go the exact same way. They attack and have him on the ropes, before he shakes them off and does a tailspin. They're just not very impressive considering Zinogre is one of the coolest fights in the entire series. I chalk this down to Zinogre being a very late addition to the game. There's 6 unique turf wars added to Iceborne. If you count the additional templates, there's by my count 18. If you add up every single monster fight in the game, including recycling but excluding subspecies and variants, you have 49 turf wars. With the same criteria, World had 21, so together that makes 70. So is all this recycling bad? In many ways yes, but there are reasons as for why things turned out this way. The massive increase in turf war recycling is largely the result of 35 new monsters being added to the game, especially with the more unique ones. They're pretty expensive and time consuming to animate, and with so many new monsters and types, It's far more economic to just make a few animations and reuse them across dozens of interactions. I also think the huge amounts of monsters are why so many more turf wars end in stalemates. Iceborne's early game additions are Banbaro, Beotodus, and a few subspecies, and the rest are mid to late game additions. And because those monsters largely fight the existing mid to late game threats, we end up with many draws, as opposed to the clear hierarchy world would present. It certainly makes sense as to how things ended up this way, but it is disappointing because it was really cool to analyse how the world locales were structured, and Iceborne kind of just messes it up. The guiding lands is likely another reason why the number of turf wars has exponentially increased, to the point there was more recycling too. This is an endgame free hunting, multi-biome locale, where pretty much every standard monster can be fought, including elder dragons. Players spend a lot of time here, and with so many different monsters roaming around, perhaps the developers wanted it to be possible for a turf war to happen no matter which monster was present, which does end up working out. Much of the footage I recorded for this video was in the guiding lands for this reason. So was Iceborne disappointing in how it handled its turf wars? Somewhat. But are many of them still really cool? Yeah, I would say so. I praised Odogaron's turf wars in World. He's such an agile, vicious monster, and I love watching him brawl, so it was great to see him get more turf wars in Iceborne. I also like that he gets to fight Legiana, which feels like a turf war that should have been in World. Something really interesting happens when Glavenus faces Rathalos, because this is currently the only turf war in the series to have a random chance of being completely different. You can either witness a unique animation where Glavenus gets the upper hand, or watch as Rathalos lifts him up like in his Anjanath turf war. So either monster can win, with a different animation each time. On one hand, the recycling problem I mentioned earlier has come up again because oh my god, Glavenus should not have lost so badly. But on the other hand, it is so cool that there's a variable outcome for either monsters coming out on top. I wouldn't mind seeing that for other monsters, especially those who currently stalemate. Brachydios vs Rathalos is interesting because like Velkhana vs Ruin Gigante, it is sort of recycled from another turf war. In this case, Rathalos vs Deviljho, where Rathalos lands on him only to be grabbed by Deviljho and thrown to the ground. But this turf war has been changed, so that Brachydios opens by punching Rathalos and then grabbing him with his fists to chuck him into the ground. Rathalos is still animated the same, but the animations they made for Deviljho have been changed to reflect Brachydios' unique abilities. Rathalos' animations for the Deviljho turf war also happen for his fight with Glavenus. Once again, Glavenus does not recycle Deviljho's animations completely, instead opening with a sword strike that Rathalos has been sped up to dodge. They clearly used the first turf war as a base, but made it into something unique. For many people, Rojang's turf war with Savage Deviljho was very disappointing. This was a matchup people have wanted to see since like 2013, and it ended up being identical to the Ruin Gigante turf war. It definitely sucks when you've been wanting something for so long, only for the big reveal that it's something you've seen before. I personally think that as far as recycled turf wars go, this is fine, because it's in character for both of them, and it is cool how Rojang turns golden as he readies the punch, but maybe something unique would have been better. The excessive recycling is the real issue with Iceborne's turf wars. It's not that it can't be done well, the main issue is that it has to make sense for the monsters and still be cool to see. For example, Odogaron vs Rathalos or Legiana. The flying monsters attack with their talons and jaws, while Odogaron gets to use his own abilities. But on the other hand, you have most of Brachydios and Glavenus' turf wars, which rarely make use of their own unique traits, which can be disappointing, especially when Iceborne's very own flagship is a victim of this. Of course, some monsters do share similarities with each other, and so having a recycled turf war would make sense, but it can still be disappointing, and in some ways they acknowledge that. Brachydios and Deviljho are not very alike, and so they adjusted the Rathalos turf war to reflect that. They did not want Velkhana to lose to Nergigante as badly as Kushala did, so she still gets to fight back a bit. But those adjustments are often both not enough, or not done for the other turf wars, which leads to the problems mentioned earlier. Iceborne added a lot of monsters to World, and with them, a lot of turf wars, and while there were many good unique ones, there were also more recycled than ever before. Most of them result in a stalemate, and as a result, it kind of ruins the ecology that World built. The recycling means that many of the newer, unique monsters cannot show off their own abilities, and this even extends to the game's own flagship monster. Will the next game take a different approach, or double down? Turf Wars returned for Monster Hunter Rise. Like Iceborne, this game introduced even more unique monster types, as now we have Leviathans and more fanged beasts aside from Rojang. As such, more Turf Wars were introduced, and many were brought back from World and Iceborne. The reveal trailer showed returning Azoras, battling newcomer amphibian Tetranodon, with the frog sticking the bear in his mouth at one point. This turf war is recycled for Lagombi and Volvidon too, as they're similar in body structure to Azora's. Tetranodon wins each time. Rise gives us Leviathan turf wars. The first is a battle between the bird wyvern Agnesom and Somnicanth. Agnesom briefly gets the upper hand, before Somnicanth manages to smack him back and release sleep gas, winning the fight. The fanged beast Bishaten can turf war with muddy Leviathan Almudron. Bishaten jumps onto Almudron and smashes fruit into his face, before getting grabbed and pulled halfway into the ground. He escapes, only for Almudron to anticipate that and catch him mid-air, resulting in a win for the Leviathan. Tetranodon can also turf war with Gos Harag, the giant yeti-like fanged beast who lives in the Frost Island, and in a hilarious subversion of the Azora's turf war, gets absolutely demolished trying to fight someone his own size. Zinogre can face off with returning Generation's flagship Mizutsune, getting blasted with water and having the Leviathan wrap around him, only to break free and smash him into the ground. This results in a win for Zinogre. And then there's Magnamalo. In Rise, he had one turf war at launch, where he'd fight flying monsters Agnesom, Barioth, Rathalos and later Basilgoose. The wyverns fly to create some distance, but Magnamalo leaps up to them, grabbing on and taking a ride. They break free only for Magnamalo to boost up, grab and launch them into the ground, which results in a win for him. This turf war is interesting for two reasons. The first is that it has two variations. Sometimes Magnamalo will rush up to his opponent and smash his tail down, before leaping into the air with them. The second tends to happen if you're fighting one of the monsters already and Magnamalo enters the area. He'll slowly walk to the side while eyeing his enemy, before leaping into the air immediately. The rest of it goes the same way. The second interesting reason is that Magnamalo will always target a player when dive bombing, which will actually damage you. A monster targeting you during a turf war is unprecedented, and it absolutely caught most people off guard. This happens to be Basilgoose's second turf war ever, and his first loss. In the later updates, Magnamalo could also do this to Kushala Daora and Teostra, but the only difference is that they would blast him with wind or fire upon landing, and so Magnamalo loses this one. Many monsters who appeared in World and Iceborne are also in Rise, and as such, so are their turf wars. Rathalos still beats down Anjanath, still fights with Nargacuga and Tigrex, but there are some omissions. Gyrotodus and Barroth no longer share a locale, and therefore cannot turf war each other, and until Sunbreak's release, Rajan could not fight Kushala and Teostra either. The only recycling we see in Rise with new turf wars is with Tetranodon and the Fanged Beasts, and Magnamalo with the Flying Wyverns, but there's a fair bit more with some of World and Iceborne's turf wars, in order to account for some of Rise's additions, but also absences of Iceborne monsters, and so there's some interesting choices made. Remember Rathalos lifting Anjanath? This can also happen with Tobi Kadachi, Bishaten, Kuliyaku, and the Great Rogi. Speaking of Anjanath, he's been handled really interestingly. His turf war against Great Jagras has been recycled for the Great Rogi, Kuliyaku, and even Tetranodon. It looks kind of bizarre. What's more, is that all of Fulgur Anjanath's turf wars have been given to him. Fulgur was a significantly stronger monster, and with the absence of Glavenus and Brachydios, the Brute's Wyvern turf wars likely would have gone to waste, so now they're given to Anjanath, which creates some contradictions, we'll get to them later. Rathian only really fought Diablos in World, but now she shares many turf wars with Rathalos. She beats Anjanath, and fights with Nargacuga and Zinogre. While Rathalos would shoot down a stream of fire onto Anjanath, Rathian shoots a single fireball, so the turf war was adjusted to reflect her abilities. While Iceborne seemed to prioritise making sure as many monsters as possible could have a turf war, Rise seems more focused on giving at least one unique turf war to most of its new additions, and doing some clever recycling to pad it out for some of the returning monsters. I would argue it handles its turf wars better than Iceborne did, but not as good as World. The new ones are great, and cover a wide variety of monsters across different regions, and the designers were generally more clever in terms of recycling, as now lower tiered monsters get to battle more. I think functionally, it's good to see more unique battles again, because they do genuinely go crazy. Tetranodon stuffing Azoras in his mouth, Almudron catching Bishaten, Zinogre slamming Mizutsune. This stuff to me is cooler than a lot of what we saw in Iceborne, and as cool as many of World's turf wars. The monsters get to do interesting things in these fights again, and what helps is how diverse Rise's monster roster is. Frogs, leviathans and bears can do a lot of different things compared to your average flying or brute wyvern. Magnamalo's turf war especially is so amazing to see, because despite not having wings, he's relentless in chasing down his aerial opponents, and directly aiming the dive bomb at you is insane. Nothing like that has ever happened in a turf war before. It's also quite refreshing to see clear winners and losers after Iceborne, because we can sort of make a hierarchy again, although not to the same extent we could in World. For example, Tetranodon is clearly stronger than Azoras and his peers, but weaker than Gosharag, who is both stronger and more agile. Somnacanth is stronger than Agnesom, and Almudron is stronger than Bishaten. I do wish it was as extensive as it was in World, but I think Rise's larger monster count makes that difficult to achieve, not to mention that ecology is not really the focus of this game. We can't talk about Turf Wars in Rise without bringing up Wyvern riding, a new mechanic that replaced the old mounting system. Upon dealing enough aerial or wirebug damage to a monster, you can make them rideable and control them with the wirebugs, and from there you can either smash them into walls or fight other monsters, dealing massive damage. You get to perform the monster's attacks yourself, and kind of make your own Turf Wars. There are other ways of making monsters rideable too. You can use a special puppet spider, or a Turf War can happen, and one of the monsters will become rideable as a result. If a monster loses, they'll be made rideable, but if it's a tie, either monster has a random chance. This means that we effectively have a full confirmation as to who wins and loses Turf Wars. In World, it was pretty clear cut, the monster that takes damage loses. But this got more and more uncertain as time went on, because Iceborne had so many battles where they'd both take damage, and sometimes one monster would take more damage than the other. It's not really clear. So let's look at some interesting details. First of all, Rathalos and Rathian lose the Turf Wars against Zinogre, Nagakuga and Tigrex, as they're always made rideable. But what's even weirder is that Anjanath also loses to them, and to Diablos as well, which is extremely weird because Anjanath gets a solid hit on all of them, even lifting Diablos off the ground. This is an extreme case of bad recycling, because these Turf Wars were designed for Volga Anjanath. The base version is not exactly entry level, but he loses to Rathalos, whereas Volga is definitively a mid-game threat, and so his Turf Wars were designed with the idea that he would tie with the other mid-game threats, having him give as good as he gets. Anjanath is not as strong, so the developers made him lose, despite the animation being designed to be a tie, so there's a real contradiction here. Another detail I touched upon earlier is that Magnamalo loses the Turf War against Kushala Daora and Teostra. I say it again, because a lot of people are under the assumption that he beats them. This is not true, he is always made rideable, but I can totally see why people think he wins, as the animation is mostly recycled from his only other Turf War in the game. They did try to distinguish his Turf War a bit, as Kushala and Teostra do blast him back, but not enough in my opinion, because I struggle to see how that was enough to make him lose, especially after he brought them down from the sky, and considering the confusion, it seems a lot of people agree with me. I do like it from a lore standpoint. Magnamalo can dominate most regular monsters, and will attempt to unsuccessfully challenge Elder Dragons. Another unique aspect about Turf Wars in Rise is that monsters can be afflicted with elemental blight if they're hit by related attacks. They're set on fire if hit by a fireball, taking gradual damage for a while. They're softened if hit by a water blast, making them take more damage. They become slower if smashed by ice, and are easier to stun if struck by thunder. The player can also inflict these by throwing various beetles, but the blight occurring through Turf Wars is another way they can assist the players. Overall, Rise handles its Turf Wars pretty well, but far from perfectly. I think my biggest issue is that, much of the time, they don't really happen. Here's something I didn't mention when discussing Turf Wars in World. Sometimes the monsters don't immediately fight upon being in the same area. They'll leave, team up on you, or even just attack each other using standard attacks. Eventually it will happen, but it can take a while in certain cases. One monster has to call, and the other has to answer, and if that doesn't happen, the monsters will not Turf War. This is also the case in Rise, except Wyvern riding makes a complete mess of things, because if one monster ignores the call, the other will just walk up and perform an ordinary attack, making them Wyvern rideable, and this prevents a Turf War from occurring for a good 10 minutes or so. So because of that, it's very easy to miss a lot of the Turf Wars. This is especially frequent if you're already in combat with one of the monsters, but it can happen even if they're not doing anything. And let me tell you, do you know what's worse than hoping for a unique Turf War and getting a recycled one? It would be hoping for any Turf War and getting nothing. I've seen people say online that in all their hours they have not seen a single Turf War in Rise, and it's very easy to understand why. I myself have had many occasions where I've played with a newcomer friend, tried to instigate a Turf War for a cool moment, only for nothing special to happen, and it's really deflating. Another minor issue is that the Turf Wars in World felt a lot more dynamic. Like in Rise, the monsters will see each other, and first carefully position themselves so the Turf War can begin without any issues. World doesn't do this as much, and so a lot of the turf wars feel more seamless there. All the turf wars in Rise end with one monster entering the rideable state, and this means they end very neatly, with one monster calmly backing down. This wasn't the case in World. Turf wars would end with one monster on the floor or retreating in some manner. Teostra vs Kushala Daora is a good example. The world fights would end with one or both dragons rising into the sky before transitioning areas, which looked cool. In Rise they just land, which is a bit of an anticlimax. It's worth mentioning all these technical issues with turf wars are also in Sunbreak. By the end of Iceborne, very few monsters in World had no turf wars. It was pretty much just some entry level monsters, Silver Rathalos and Gold Rathian, and Lavasioth. In Rise there's a lot more. Basarios, Royal Ludroth, Great Baggy, and Azuchi don't have any, but also unique monsters like Kezu don't either. It would have been really cool to see how he deals with larger threats. Gyrotodus does not fight Baroth, but he also doesn't fight anyone else either. Raknakadaki is a literal spider, yet there's no turf wars for her, which is so disappointing. What's worse is that Elder Dragons Chameleos and Crimson Glow Valstrax have no turf wars either, which is such a shame considering what these monsters are capable of. Can you imagine someone like Magnamalo leaping for Chameleos, only for him to turn invisible and launch a surprise attack? Or how crazy a Valstrax battle could be? Valstrax does have a unique mechanic called the Ambush. Normally this is an attack, where he flies high in the sky and performs a very fast dive bomb. But in Rise, he will also specifically target monsters with it as an invader. It is pretty cool, and monsters are automatically knocked down when attacked with this. So from that standpoint, you could argue that Valstrax would win any turf war, but still. There's also another special mechanic. Wind Serpent Ibushi and Thunder Serpent Nawa have no turf wars whatsoever, which is normal for special bosses like them. However, during a special high rank quest, Nawa will consume the blood of a dying Ibushi, killing him and becoming Nawa the All-Mother. This is a cool monster vs monster interaction, reminiscent of 4 Ultimate Celtus Queen, but it's also the first time we've seen a monster become their variant in real-time gameplay. We've only seen this once before, in an FMV cutscene, which is once again a reminder of how far we've come. I think that generally Rise handled turf wars better than Iceborne. While the ecology aspect isn't as fleshed out as it was in World, having many more winners and losers is very refreshing, not to mention more unique battles. I also think Rise is better about recycling turf wars in some cases. However, there are some weird choices that were made with other turf wars, particularly with Anjanath, and on a technical level, the Wyvern riding becomes a massive hindrance in terms of actually seeing them. Sunbreak introduces over 10 unique turf wars. In terms of monster additions, there weren't that many subspecies and it was largely just returning and new monsters. Like Rise, Sunbreak is focused on giving its new additions at least one unique turf war. But this time, aside from subspecies and variants, there is very little recycling done. Rajang was given back his turf wars with Kushala Daora and Teostra, which are confirmed to result in a tie, even with Furious Rajang. I'm not entirely sure why they weren't in Rise to begin with, considering almost all the other Iceborne turf wars were present. If I had to guess, it could be because Kushala and Teostra were added in a title update. Maybe the developers wanted them to feel extra strong and not tie with a base game monster. With Sunbreak, they're all together in the same rank, so giving them back this tied turf war makes sense. It's worth mentioning that this is a bit like Odogaron vs Legiana, where it was added with the expansion, but you can still see it in the base game. There is another new turf war just like this too, as Rajang was given a brand new battle with Bazelgeuse, and this fight is really interesting. Rajang grabs his tail and swings him around, like with the other flying wyverns, but Basil's bombs cause him to stagger, releasing his grip and allowing Basil a chance to dive bomb. It's a funny bait and switch. At first you think it's a recycled turf war, only for the bombs to interfere and create a unique outcome. It does make me think that Magnamalo beats Bazelgeuse specifically because his bombs can't really do much damage. After all, Magnamalo lives and breathes hellfire explosions. He's massively resistant to them, so it makes sense that he would beat Bazelgeuse. This specific Rajang vs Bazelgeuse turf war, on the other hand, results in a tie. Astalos returns and battles Mizitsune, who gets a few hits on him including a water laser, before overextending, being smacked away as they tumble over, resulting in a tie. Gormagala faces off with fellow flagship monster of the same game, Soregios, dodging his rushes and overpowering him with his massive wing arms and blasting the frenzy at point blank range. Soregios manages to rise and fire several blade scales, resulting in a tie. Newcomers Garen Gorm and Luna Garon have a turf war. Luna attempts to jump on Garen, but gets knocked away. Dives at him again as they tumble over. Garen Gorm almost gets a punch in, but Luna Garon activates his icy armor, pushes him off, and rushes forward with a backflip, which results in a clean win for him. Lunagaron also has a turf war with Zinogre. They size each other up. Then Zinogre dives as Lunagaron evades. They simultaneously power up and wrestle before Lunagaron gets the upper hand and knocks Zinogre over, but he responds with a tailspin, knocking them both out of their powered up states and ending the fight in a tie. Now we get to the Elder Dragons. Monster Hunter Frontiers Espinas can fight Kushala Daora. Kushala stamps down on him, but Espinas responds by charging and chucking him behind, resulting in a tie. Newcomer and flagship monster Malzeno can face off with Lunagaron, who manages to put up a real fight by grabbing Malzeno's head and smashing it on the ground. Malzeno responds by grabbing him with his tail claws, throwing him up in the air, catching him and chucking him down, resulting in a win for the Elder Dragon. And finally, Scorned Magnamalo can fight Malzeno in one of the wildest turf wars yet. Scorned dives at Malzeno, who dodges, and the two dragons clash blades. Malzeno tries to get on Scorned's back and is shaken off. Scorned rocket jumps as Malzeno lasers him, resulting in a huge explosion that damages them both, ending the fight in a tie. This is technically the first turf war to be exclusive to a variant. You could argue that Iceborne's Turf Wars with Bruinina Gigante and Savage Deviljho are variant-only turf wars, but there's nothing suggesting the base versions wouldn't have them if they were present in Iceborne, which they're not. Magnamalo is present and fightable in Sunbreak, but he cannot fight Malzeno like this. Those are the base game turf wars, but update monsters brought some more with them. Velkhana returned for the 4th update. Her turf wars with Kushala Daora and Teostra are also back, and are confirmed to be wins for her. However, she can also face off with risen Kushala Daora and Teostra. If you recall, Velkhana would end those turf wars by firing a laser, but in this case, the risen dragons will be the one to fire it, winning the turf wars instead. She is also confirmed to lose to Rajang. Sunbreak Velkhana gets 3 brand new, fully unique turf wars. The first is against both Magnamalo and Scorned Magnamalo, who dive towards her as she dodges and responds with 3 tail stabs. Magnamalo grabs it on the 3rd stab and swings her around, before giving chase as she evades his dives. Suddenly, she freezes his feet to the ground and prepares several ice crystals in the air to hurt him, and Magnamalo frees himself with a Hellfire explosion, which ends the fight and results in a tie. The main difference is that Scorned Magnamalo frees himself with Dragon Element's Hellfire blasts, while Magnamalo uses the normal kind. The second is against the standard Malzeno. I'll let you watch first. This results in a tie. The entire turf war is lightning fast and there's a lot to it. As Malzeno dashes into Velkhana, she almost manages to stab him in the neck before he front flips and knocks her away with his tail. While Velkhana creates icy crystals, Malzeno brings out the Curio, and when they come together, you can see Malzeno catch Velkhana's tail with his own claws. While this is happening, the Curio are destroying the ice crystals. The third turf war came with Primordial Malzeno, who was added in a later update. Primordial strikes with his wing and is deflected by Velkhana's tail. He blocks an ice blast but gets stabbed as she creates distance. Velkhana performs another ice blast, but Primordial blocks it again before performing a triple melee combo and winning the fight. This is the very first time in the series where a monster and their variant have 2 different turf wars against the same foe, and there's likely a reason for this, which I'll touch upon later. Primordial does in fact recycle Malzeno's turf wars with Scorned Magnamalo and Lunagaron. The final turf war is not technically a turf war, but it is a monster battle. Bringing Master Itsushi to the final battle against Amatsu will have him summon Apex Zinogre with a stink make, who proceeds to attack Amatsu. The two fight in the air before Amatsu smacks him down so viciously that he's made rideable, which has never happened with an Apex monster before. This is not classified as a turf war, but it's worth mentioning regardless. The theme of Sunbreak's turf wars is quality over quantity. There's very little recycling done, even among the newcomers. For monsters like Astalos, Zoragios and Espinas, these are their only turf wars. They don't share any with Rathalos or each other, even though they arguably could. Earlier I mentioned that turf wars in World did 3 things very well. They conveyed the food chains to us, give us a better look at the monster's abilities, and let us see cool matchups between fan favourites. Sunbreak does the first one okay, but the second 2 very well. Firstly, the new Turf Wars in Sunbreak are, in my opinion, some of the best in the series. They really show off the monster's abilities so well, and it's hard to pick a favourite. Look at Astalos and Mizutsune for a moment. The way Mizutsune slides around and lands a laser attack, but then tries to flip onto him, only to be countered as they tumble over. Or Zenoga and Lunagaran sizing each other up, attacking, and then simultaneously powering up. Or Scorned Magnamalo and Malzeno having a literal sword fight. It's just fantastic, and it really makes me resent Iceborne's excessive amount of recycling even more. Watching this Turf War, I can't help but wonder if the developers regret ruining their Gigante vs Valkana. It would have been so easy for them to just recycle the old Magnamalo Turf War, but they didn't. Sunbreak seems to have taken the same approach as Rise, which is to give almost every newcomer at least one unique Turf War. Once again, there's not really a hierarchy with the monsters, with the exception of the three lords. Garon Gorm, Lunagaran and Malzeno are three monsters that reside in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak's new locale, the Citadel. This locale has three regions: a forest, icy mountains, and a ruined castle, with each monster sort of ruling over them. The Turf Wars do establish something of a pecking order. Lunagaran handily beats Garon Gorm, which puts the Fanged Beast firmly at the bottom. However, Malzeno beats Lunagaran, so we can see who is first, second and third among the three. There exists concept art for a Malzeno and Garon Gorm Turf War, and there's even key art depicting the two of them fighting, but this does not make it into the final game. It's worth mentioning that virtually half of these Turf Wars result in a tie, which is something I criticised Iceborne for. I don't have as much of an issue in Sunbreak, however, purely because there's less introduced overall. The third great aspect of Turf Wars was that we would get to see fantastic monster matchups between both old and new fan favourites, and Sunbreak leans into this the most out of any of the games. You can see the developers had this in mind when they decided who gets to fight who. Astalos and Mizutsune are both flagships from Generations, so seeing them fight is quite significant. Espinas and Frontier was rumoured to have killed a Kushala Deora, a very significant feat for a flying wyvern, and Sunbreak finally gives us a fight between them. Zenoga and Lunagaron are both inspired by wolves, and Gormagala and Seregios are both flagships from 4 Ultimate. Likewise, Magnamalo and Malzeno are the flagships of Rise and Sunbreak, so seeing them fight is equally as significant. I'll say it again, I think what really encompasses my issue with Iceborne's handling of Turf Wars is that they genuinely were too excessive with the recycling. Iceborne gives us roughly 27 additional Turf Wars, Sunbreak gives us 10, but these ones are so much more memorable due to actually being unique. The main cause of this is development time for sure. Iceborne gave us more monsters than Sunbreak did, and the Iceborne developers were focused on giving a lot of them Turf Wars, and so many of them had to be recycled, including for its own flagship. Valkana had multiple Turf Wars in that game, but they're all shared with the other Elder Dragons. Conversely, Sunbreak gives Valkana 3 Turf Wars that are all unique to her. What's different this time is that she was added to Sunbreak with its 4th update, so the developers had ample time to work on her along with Risen Crimson Glow Valstrax. The extra time is likely what allowed them to give her those 2 Turf Wars, and then an additional one when Primordial Malzeno was added. And because they're tailor-made for Valkana and her opponents, she actually gets to use her own abilities, stabbing Magnamalo, getting her tail grabbed in response, freezing him to the ground. These are things she could only do. What's more is that Magnamalo and the Malzenos get to fight in ways that are unique to them too, and it's fantastic to see. They could have easily recycled 2 other Turf Wars for this. How disappointing would that have been? Her battle with Malzeno is the best in the entire series in my opinion. The way they both move so fast, attempting to stab with their tails, Valkana bringing out her ice crystals as Malzeno brings out the Curio, and they both rush at each other. It looks like a much better version of the Kushala vs Teostra Turf War. Primordial Malzeno getting an entirely different Turf War is very interesting, and I believe it's because Malzeno has the Curio, but Primordial in his default state does not, only gaining them some time in the fight against him. As a result, we get a unique Turf War that makes use of Primordial's other abilities. As mentioned earlier, Sunbreak doesn't really recycle any of its new Turf Wars, but it also doesn't really recycle the old ones either. Rise recycled a lot of Iceborne Turf Wars for many of its early game monsters, and semi-recycled Magnamalo vs Rathalos as well as Tetranodon vs Zoros. Sunbreak does not do this with any of its new monsters or Turf Wars, even though it easily could have. They could have recycled Magnamalo vs Kushala Deora for both Malzeno and Valkana, but also Seregios, Espinas, Astalos, maybe even Gormagala. Maybe they could have recycled Malzeno into the Kushala vs Teostra Turf War. They even could have used the Flying Wyverns for many of Rathalos' other Turf Wars, but they didn't. And the result is that there's less Turf Wars, but the ones that exist feel higher quality. I can't help but feel that they did this as a response to the recycling criticism. The Iceborne Turf Wars were highly criticised for the constant recycling, but even Rise got a lot of flack too. Magnamalo's Turf War, despite being the coolest thing ever, did frustrate people for happening with 4, arguably 6 different monsters. And funnily enough, I've seen plenty of anger at him beating Basilgoose, which people think shouldn't be the case, and I'm sure you can imagine how that got worse when people assumed he also beat Kushala and Teostra. The result of this is that Sunbreak's Turf Wars feel far more unique, at the cost of monsters like Seregios or Espinas only getting a single one each. Sunbreak does recycle some of Rise's Turf Wars, and this leads to some interesting details being revealed. Scorned Magnamalo inherits Magnamalo's Turf Wars with Kushala and Teostra, but while Magnamalo loses to them, Scorned wins, as they're always made rideable when they fight against him. Malzeno ties with Scorned and Velkhana, but Primordial can beat Velkhana and tie with Scorned, so now there's some weirdness going on. Velkhana ties with Magnamalo, but beats the other elders, who can beat Magnamalo. Scorned beats those elders, but ties with Malzeno and Velkhana, who tie with each other. Velkhana beats Kushala, Deora and Teostra, who tie with Rajang, who beats Velkhana? You can argue this works as a rock paper scissors mechanic, but it just seems like a mess to me. It also can't be overstated how bad her Rajang Turf War looks next to her Magnamalo and Malzeno Turf Wars. Something I really like about Rise and Sunbreak is that there's many quests where they'll pair up monsters that have a Turf War, so it's relatively easy to see them. This is why I was able to get all the footage for Sunbreak myself, as opposed to Iceborne where I had to ask MonsterSlayerSquad. There is one exception to this however, and that is Malzeno vs Velkhana. For some reason, there is not a single man-made quest featuring the two of them, and so the only way you'll ever be able to see this Turf War is if you get lucky through expeditions or anomaly investigations, which really sucks. I am slightly disappointed with other aspects of Sunbreak's Turf Wars. Daimyo Hermitor and Shogun Cyanotor didn't get anything. They are both Carapacions, so it would have been really cool to see how they deal with other threats. Chaotic Gore Magala and Shigaru Magala get no Turf Wars either, which is wildly disappointing. There was a lot that could be done there. Speaking of Magalas, Gore's Turf War with Seregios is probably the most underwhelming new Turf War. They both move very slowly, and it doesn't feel as dynamic as the others do. The two were likely paired due to their status as 4 ultimate flagships, but I think you could have paired either of them up with someone else, and it would have made for far more interesting fights. I guess it does work out because the Shigaru Magala intro shows him beating Seregios fairly easily, so it draws a comparison between him and Gore, but I just find the animation somewhat unimpressive compared to all the others. So those are Sunbreak's Turf Wars. With a focus on unique fan favourite battles, we essentially got some of the best Turf Wars in the entire series, at the cost of it being the only Turf Wars some of these monsters got. There's still some recycling oddities, and Rise's issues still remain, but it was a good approach nonetheless. Monster Hunter World introduced Turf Wars to the series, where monsters could battle each other and inflict massive damage. They were extremely well animated and helped to convey many different aspects of the game's ecology to the player, and despite so many being introduced, they were all unique, with only a few being recycled with some post-launch monsters. But even they managed to bring in new types of monster interactions. The Iceborne expansion increased the monster count, variety, and amount of Turf Wars, more than tripling the overall count by adding battles between newcomers and existing monsters. The high volume of Turf Wars came at a cost, as a huge amount of them were recycled in ways that were disappointing, especially among the more unique monsters introduced with the expansion. There were also a large amount of stalemates, which are less interesting, as they kind of destroyed the ecology world presented to us. Rise brought in some of its own unique Turf Wars and recycled many Iceborne ones, to varying degrees of success, and Sunbreak pretty much just introduced new Turf Wars with minimal recycling. But none of the entries managed to have them reflect the ecology like World did. That game made use of them to communicate the food chains of each locale, but each subsequent entry focused more on the idea of monsters fighting. Iceborne wanted as many monsters as possible to have Turf Wars, which led to the rampant recycling. Rise gave Turf Wars to a good chunk of its monster roster, either by recycling an existing Iceborne battle or by creating a new one. And Sunbreak just fully committed to the spectacle of having our favourite guys duel, specifically by pairing monsters with historical significance with each other. It is somewhat ironic that out of these 4 entries, World has the least diversity among its monsters, but by far the biggest amount of unique Turf Wars introduced at once, with 0 recycling in the entire game, with the exception of its title updates. Iceborne had less development time, and Rise and Sunbreak were lower budget entries that reused a lot of work from World, and with their much larger rosters, they probably weren't in a position to try and make 20 new, unique Turf Wars. Recycling is the big problem here, but it's absolutely inevitable considering how time-consuming and expensive Turf Wars are to produce. It seems like the only way we'll get a world situation again is if we have another main entry with a relatively small roster, and I don't know if I want that. To fix the recycling, there's a few things that could be done. It wasn't a big deal in World because the monsters were interchangeable. Rathalos and Legiana, Teostra and Lunastra, they're all kind of similar in terms of offensive abilities, so as long as their opponent is unique, it should be fine. Where it got a little bit ridiculous is when they started creating Turf Wars for Volga and Jannath, and then just handed them to Glavenus and Brachydios. Same with the Pseudo-Wyverns. Those Turf Wars have pretty much zero flavour to them. There's a couple of Turf Wars that really stand out to me, Brachydios vs Rathalos and Rajang vs Bazalguz. The first one is a semi-recycled Turf War, but in reverse, because it was built for Deviljho to fight Rathalos or Legiana, but in this case, their animations were reused for this fight, while Deviljho was swapped with Brachydios. Only Brachydios is animated to use his fists, so now this Turf War is unique to him. Then there's Rajang vs Bazalguz. Rajang normally grabs flying monsters like Rathalos or, oh god, Puke, and swings them around by the tail. The Turf War is semi-recycled, and you're supposed to believe the same thing with Bazalguz, only for him to break through thanks to his bombs and counter-attack. It's a fantastic bait and switch that kind of plays with our assumptions on how they've recycled Turf Wars in the past. So I'm wondering how feasible it would be to readjust existing Turf Wars to just be slightly more unique, give them a slightly different outcome, or change how one monster fights. Take Nargacuga vs Rathalos. Instead of diving at Rathalos and landing on top, what if Nargacuga ends with a tail slam? That way the Turf War would work for them both. Likewise, the Brute Wyverns. Instead of leading with a hip check, maybe Brachydios opens with a punch that knocks Tyrex over before he retaliates. What if Glavenus immediately swings his sword? Let's look at the Odogaron Turf Wars. Barioth and Tigrex, those ones are good, but maybe Nargacuga shakes him off with a tailspin. Odogaron vs Glavenus also works pretty well, and there's even a moment where Glavenus spins, and his tail has the sword sound effect. But he opens with a bite attack, so it doesn't really work for Brachydios. What if he jabbed his horn down instead? And instead of using his mouth, grabs Odogaron with his fist and slams him into the ground. Odogaron's animations would not have to be changed, but the Turf War would feel much more unique to Brachydios. How about the Zenoga Brute Wyvern Turf Wars? Brachydios grabs him with his mouth. Maybe he should use his fists. A cool side effect of changing up the Brute Wyvern Turf Wars is that Volga and Jannath would feel a bit more distinct in them, since now the attacks he performs would be unique to him, and it wouldn't feel like he's dragging his fellow brutes down. This doesn't work for everyone. I think Velkhana's Ruiner and Rajang Turf Wars are unsalvageable, and just need a redo, especially after what we got in Sunbreak. In fact, it would be better if a lot of Turf Wars were redone to be more unique. One such example is the old Kushala vs Teostra battle in World. It was fine at the time, but they recycled it for Velkhana too, when I think they could probably do something more interesting. Velkhana vs Malzeno feels like a massively enhanced version of it. In terms of the future of Turf Wars, I have zero doubt that they will appear in Monster Hunter Wilds, but I do wonder how they'll be expanded upon. Rise gave us Wyvern Riding and Elemental Blights. The former I do not expect to return, and the latter, yeah, maybe, you know. Glavenus vs Rathalos is the only Turf War to currently have a variable outcome, where either monster can come out on top, with their own unique animation. I wonder if we'll see more. It would technically be a lot more work without recycling, as you would need two different animations, but it would be really cool to see two monsters come together, and be unsure as to who will win. It would be cool if we could affect the outcome in some way, perhaps with part breaks, like if we severed Zenoga's tail, should he really be able to smack his enemies away? The Wilds trailer showed an almost unprecedented amount of small monsters in one area, and what looks like a stampede. If the game is expanding their role to be more involved in the gameplay, what if they got into Turf Wars too? Not just with each other, but with larger monsters. It wouldn't really be the first time either. The series has had a long history of depicting large monsters battling smaller ones, mostly in cutscenes, but as of try, also in real-time gameplay. Wouldn't it be awesome to have dynamic real-time encounters? Imagine Rathalos getting got like Mufasa. I'm really looking forward to seeing how they handle the ecology aspect in Wilds. I've come to appreciate it a lot more in World after recording all these Turf Wars. A lot of the detail in this game was only possible with the power of the PlayStation 4 CPU and equivalent systems, and even that was pretty weak. The PS5 is so much stronger, so they'll be capable of so much more. So that's the history of Turf Wars in the Monster Hunter series. Which turf war is your favourite, and which is your least? How would you like to see them evolve going forward? Let me know in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.